great to see this turnout. Thank you all for coming. So be honest, was it just the free drinks? What got you in here? So I hope you know what you're in for. I mean, this isn't going to be introduction to watercolors, friends. This is, I'm going to take on some of the things that you read about in the paper. I'm going to take them directly on things that you've thought were true perhaps your whole life. And I'm really passionate about this subject. I'm very excited. And I want to hope that gets through, and also why I think this is so important for our society today. So the title of my talk is Genesis History? And borrowing the model that Father Chris uses from his sermons, I'm going to break it down into 3 parts. The first part is, what is Genesis? And does this work? There we go. There we go. What is Genesis and what does it say? Second part's, what's the scientific and historical evidence? And the third part, why does it matter? Why are we talking about this? Okay, so what is Genesis, number 1? What's the evidence, number 2? And why are we talking, number 3? So let's start. What is Genesis? Well, the word Genesis means beginning or mode of formation. So if somebody asks you, what's the genesis of that idea? It means, how did it come to be? Where did it come from? And Genesis is the name of the first book in the Bible, as Father Chris said. The Bible has 66 books written by 40 different people, and Genesis is up front. And Genesis gives a story of how everything came to be. And the theme is supernatural creation. I think you all know the first line. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay? But Genesis does a lot more than that. Genesis makes very specific claims, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. So, some of them. All human beings, according to the book of Genesis, are descended from Adam and Eve. And if, Genesis in chapters 5 and 11 has chronologies you can trace back. If you do that carefully and use the oldest known version of the book of Genesis, called the Septuagint, you get about 7,500 years ago from Adam and Eve. That's not the same version as in your pew in the church, and that's a long story. I believe the rabbi shortened the chronology in the 2nd century AD so that Jesus would come too soon to be the Messiah. But anyhow, all human beings descended from Adam and Eve is one claim. That there was a fall, a rebellion against God, which is why suffering exists. Some people say, I can't believe in God that would allow so much suffering in the world. Well, Genesis tells you why there's suffering. Genesis says that there was a global flood about 5,300 years ago, and Noah and his family built an ark to survive. And Genesis, the last line, I could see some of you having trouble reading it, is that early humans lived close to 1,000 years. So wow, those are some amazing claims, right? That's not what you read in the newspapers. So what's going on? Genesis is not only in the Christian Bible, it's a sacred book to Muslims. It's the first book for the Jewish scriptures. It's a book held sacred by 4 billion people when you add up the numbers. Half the people on this planet think Genesis is a pretty special book. But obviously you don't read this in the paper. What's going on? Well, some people will tell you that Genesis is myth. And to figure out whether that wasn't intended to be real, it's just an allegory, just stories. And so one thing you can do is look at the text of anything, literary criticism, right? What did the author mean to say? So here's a sentence from the book of Genesis. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of that month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Okay, well, if you're writing something, obviously whoever wrote that is trying to be really specific when that event happened, okay? This isn't once upon a time there was a princess language. This is very specific language. So I don't think the idea that Genesis wasn't intended to be seriously works. And actually, if you do a much deeper study of the words in Genesis and compare them to words, for example, in Psalms and Proverbs, which are more poetic, you find a very different language in Genesis. I think it's very clear from a scholarly point of view that Genesis was written to be taken seriously. So what's going on? Well, the answer, I think, is that most people would tell you that, well, now we have science, and science shows us Genesis is wrong. And that's going to be the nub of my talk, okay? And the reason one of the reasons I say that people think that science tells us Genesis is wrong is because that's what I used to think. I used to be an atheist, and fairly nasty one at that. I thought this was made up. I mean, come on, a global flood that covered the highest mountains, people living 1,000 years, animals on an ark. I mean, come on. And what happened was in my early 30s, my son was born, and my wife said, we ought to get the kid baptized. So I thought about that ridiculous statement, and I very quickly said, yes, dear. I mean, you know where I'm coming from, right? I mean, who needed that fight? You pick your battles carefully. And I thought, sprinkle a little water on the kid. Say what you want. Knock yourself out. So we went to church, and something happened. And perhaps it was the greatest gift I've ever received in my life. But I felt something. And one of the things I particularly felt was that there were people in that church who had something that I was never going to get. They had a peace. They had a serenity. They had something that I was not going to get. I was doing really well in my career and all that sort of stuff, but I could tell that was not going to get me what these people had. And I liked the people there. We kept going to church, but I told myself, Doug, you're an MIT guy. You can't believe in this stuff unless there's evidence for it. And I have spent now about 35 plus years studying the evidence, and I'm going to share a lot of that with you. So thank you. I wrote my book about 5 years ago, Counting to God, which has gotten, it's not well known, but it's got fabulous reviews on Amazon. Read them if you want. I think it is actually, modestly, about the best book ever written for some areas showing why science proves the existence of God. There's no explanation without God for the existence of life. I mean, the idea that life started in some pond somewhere is absolutely ridiculous. The top chemist in the world is a man by the name of James Tour, T-O-U-R. Google his talk on the origin of life. Absolutely destroys claims that it arose by chance. Life is more complex than anybody can possibly arise. I cover that in my book. I cover this nonsense of Darwinism, why it doesn't work, why the universe is fine-tuned, and so on. But when I wrote my book, I bought into this idea that the Earth and the universe were billions of years old. Fast forward now to just a couple years ago, a man invited me to lunch by the name of Ferd Becker. Maybe some of you know him. He used to live right across the water here. Great doctor in town, now retired in New Orleans. And he asked me a question at lunch. He said, when do you start believing in the Bible? In other words, okay, you're a Christian, Doug. You go to church. You believe in Jesus. So if you think Jesus was real, was David real 1,000 years before Jesus? What about Moses going back maybe another 800 years? Or what about Abraham about 2100 BC? Now, where's the line? Where does the Bible start becoming true? And I couldn't answer that question. So I started looking for the first time at evidence of that maybe Genesis was true. I started looking at whether Genesis could be history. And the science I found overwhelmed me. So as we look at the science, let's make one clear thing. What is science? Well, you got to distinguish between experimental science, which is the results of experiments. I have never found anything in experimental science that contradicts the Bible. And interpretive science, which is how people interpret the evidence. There's lots of interpretations of evidence, obviously. And the question to ask yourself is, looking at the experimental evidence, what best fits? Okay, which is it? Is Genesis history. Okay, so we're going to look at the scientific and historical evidence. First, we're going to start with DNA. You've all heard of DNA. DNA is code. There is no way you get a code by accident. DNA is like computer code, only much, much more complex. That's a direct quote from Bill Gates. Here's an amazing thing that happened. 2012, there was this ENCODE project. 400 plus scientists worldwide got together to study the human genome, try to figure us out. What's the code in us? And they found out that out of our 3.2 billion letters of DNA, that the code is at least 75% functional. And the lead researcher said it's likely 75 will go to 100%. We just don't know what a lot of the code does. To put that 3.2 billion in context, imagine you have a really, can't show it without messing up my mic here, but a really thick book, and you stack 1,000 of them high. I mean, a really thick book. That's about how much code each of us has in each of our 30 trillion cells. That's about enough cells equal to stars in 100 galaxies. So that's how complex the code is. The ENCODE people said we have 4 million switches in us to turn systems on, biorhythms, whatever. And there's at least 2 layers of information in the code. This is scientific results, folks, published. So what's going on with our DNA? Well, every generation, there's about 60 to 100 copying errors. Every generation, the DNA gets copied, and we have errors. And this leads to a loss of fitness. And my key point starting off is that evolution is true. Yes, things are changing. Evolution just means change, but the direction is down, not up. Every species on this planet is devolving as the errors in the code increase every single generation. There's a man named John Sanford, top geneticist at Cornell, estimates that the human race is losing fitness overall at the rate of about 1% per generation. Things like cancer, genetic diseases, and so on. How many generations? Well, if you look at the first beginning of the New Testament, the first chapter of Matthew, it traces Jesus' genealogy back to Adam. And if Adam's the first generation, then Jesus is the 77th generation. I guess God likes sevens. Go figure out. So Jesus was 2,000 years ago, say maybe 70 generations plus since then. So human beings are now at about the 150th generation. And we are declining exponentially. There's a website where you can go on if you want to find the genealogy of the English royal family back to Adam. And one website that does that says that, I guess, little Prince George, is that his name, is 158th generation descendant of Adam. Here's an interesting fact. So after the flood, I believe God changed the laws of physics at the flood, and I'll explain that later. If you plot the declining lifespan of Noah and his descendants, you get an exponential decay curve. Isn't it pretty interesting that the thousands of years ago, these facts just happen to fit a mathematical exponential decay curve? Let's talk about, there's so much to say about DNA. We have in our cells these energy factories called mitochondria. Big name, I know. But the interesting thing about these energy factories, about these mitochondria, is that the DNA, they have their own DNA, and it comes only from our mothers. So people have said, well, how many differences do we have in all the people around the world in our mitochondria DNA? And you can measure the rate, the errors occur. And here's a chart. If human beings, look at the left, if human beings are 50,000 years old, and the secular estimates are usually 200,000 to 300,000 years old, then there has to be at least 170 differences in the population as a whole. If human beings are 6,000 years old, by comparison, 20 to 80, the actual number is 38 to 40. This is hard science, folks. This is a repeatable experiment. Now let's look at another, one of yours and mine's favorite species, roundworms. Which are supposed to have been around for millions of years. When you do the same thing, you expect millions of variations in the mitochondrial DNA of roundworms. Recent creation predicts 1 to 2,000. The actual number is about 1,200 to 1,800. Again, hard science, folks. You can go through species after species after species. The numbers contradict the secular things, the secular old Earth stuff you read in the papers. There's a famous physicist who said, if it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And that simple sentence is the key to science. So in other words, don't tell me this or that is science. If something doesn't agree, if you have a theory and it doesn't agree with the experiments, then science says it wrong. So this theory that human beings and all these species are millions and billions of years old does not agree with the evidence. Here is my favorite slide of the whole presentation. This is mitochondrial DNA. The length of the line shows errors from original starting points, and the computer software has arrows. I don't know if you can see them there. 3 arrows in the middle on mitochondrial DNA, and it looks like all human beings come from those 3 women. Well, Noah had 3 daughters-in-law on the ark. Here's the Y chromosome. Us gentlemen get Y chromosome from our fathers. Here's a similar chart. I don't know which of those nodes is Noah. All men are descended from Noah, but you can see the breakdown, the errors over time. They did a study 2-3 years ago, someone did, comparing Y chromosomes differences in Africans brought over as slaves versus Africans left behind, which was a chance to compare 2 populations separated generally at a known point in history. And when they measured the rate of change over that 200 years or so and extrapolated against all the changes in the population, it suggests that our original male ancestor lived around 5,000 years ago, Noah. So what about that 1,000 years? Is that ridiculous or what? Well, here's a man named Josephus. So Josephus must have been a pretty smart guy. He was Jewish. He led a rebellion against Rome. And the Romans, not known for their mercy, let him live. Not only that, but he became the emperor's personal historian. So Josephus, around 80 AD, had access, as the emperor's historian, to all the books in the Roman Empire. And he wrote this book, Antiquities of the Jews. And in that, I'm just going to quote a bit of it, he writes, all those that have written antiquities, in other words, histories, how did we come to be, both among Greeks and barbarians. I guess in those days, if you weren't Greek or Roman, you were a barbarian. Agree to what I say here, that the ancients lived 1,000 years. So here's a historian who's known to be one of the best historians in the ancient world. Why does he write that all those who have written antiquities? Why would he lie? Why would he make this up? Fortunately, the underlying books that he was quoting are lost. He goes on and he names historian after historian, notable historians in the ancient world. Okay. This is a picture of an octopus. And the question is, according to evolutionary theorists, the octopus is evolved from a clam in the last 300 million years. Well, they sequenced the DNA for an octopus a few years ago, and the report is that the DNA of an octopus does not resemble the DNA of any other species on Earth. It is so alien they could not believe it. Octopus have 3 hearts, 8 legs. They taste through the suckers in their legs. They have part of the brains in their legs. So 2 years ago or so, about 30+ scientists write this paper, which they got published. And they say, well, obviously the octopus didn't evolve. So what happens is that every 10 million years or so, the Earth is going through some cloud that has genetic information in it, and that's how you eventually get the genetic information to build an octopus. I am not making this up, folks. I mean, that is about the most silly theory I've ever heard of. The octopus, totally alien DNA. And just one final comment on Darwinism. 2016, the Royal Society of England, one of the most prestigious scientific groups in the entire planet, held a conference saying, you know, this idea, I don't have time to get into the mechanics of Darwin's theory, but this idea that small changes gradually build complex things doesn't possibly work. Life is way too complex. So what's wrong with Darwinism? How do we fix it? They had this conference. They invited the world's top biologists, evolutionists. Nobody had an answer to the question. So they basically admitted Darwinism doesn't work. Okay, so you're going to say now, well, that's nice, Doug. You know, that's cute among the DNA stuff, but look, they date the rocks, right? You know those rocks are old, so you can't be correct. So we're going to talk now about atomic dating, and just to be clear, that's not the same subject as computer dating. That's a different subject. We're not going there. Now we're going to talk about atomic dating, also known as radiometric dating. And the idea is if you measure the amount of two different elements, some elements are unstable, they decay into other elements. You measure the amount of the elements, you know or estimate the rate of decay, and that's supposed to tell you how old the rock is or whatever. So first I want to start off with what goes on in carbon dating. So you've probably heard that term, carbon dating. So the idea is that there's cosmic rays hit nitrogen in the upper atmosphere, create an unstable form of carbon called carbon-14, which decays, has a half-life, if you're familiar with that term, of about less than 6,000 years. So what that means when you do the math is that carbon-14 cannot be detected in anything older than 100,000 years. There's just not enough of it left around to measure, okay? Yet carbon-14 is found in all fossils, all cold, and in all diamonds. It is. So what's going on here? Some people say on the fossils, well, maybe it got in through water. Well, the water didn't get down to those diamonds buried miles deep that supposedly have been there for millions of years. How do you get carbon-14 in diamonds? So people say, well, okay, but there's other forms of atomic dating, you know, uranium to lead and so on. It gets complicated. So let's look at the general idea for atomic dating. And that poor slide is supposed to be a bathtub filling up with water. So, all right, I'm going to ask you a question. Here's the scenario. You walk into a room. You have never been in this room before. Never. But being smart like you are, you quickly measure that there are 20 gallons of water in the bathtub, and the water is flowing into the bathtub at 2 gallons a minute. Okay, so who wants to tell me how long the water has been flowing into the bathtub? Thanks, Dennis. All right, so you might say 10, right? 20 gallons, 2 gallons a minute. But maybe some of you realize that to make that calculation, you just had to make 3 totally unprovable assumptions. Assumption number 1, how do you know that the bathtub didn't have water in it when somebody turned on or however the water started flowing? In other words, how do you know that God didn't make some lead at the same time he made uranium? Assumption number 2, and this is definitely wrong based on other evidence, how do you know that the water's been flowing at a constant rate? You don't know that. You just walked into the room. There's strong evidence from some of the radioactive patterns in the rocks that at the time of the flood again, the physics of the universe went wild. And third, how do you know somebody didn't take water in or take water out or put water into the bathtub? You don't know those things. So what you have is when they date the rocks, going back to atomic dating, they make assumptions They assume that God doesn't exist, that Genesis can't be true. And then they claim they've got data that proves that Genesis is wrong, that contradicts the Bible. It's circular, if you're following me here on this. Okay, you make the assumptions outside of the Bible, and then you get a result outside of the Bible. So, us lawyers have a technical name for that kind of reasoning. I won't give you the full Latin, but the initials are BS. Okay? I mean, that doesn't work. Okay, so, all right, we talked about DNA, we talked about atomic dating. Let's talk about the fossil evidence. So I asked my nephew, why do you think the world is old? And he says, well, the fossils. Okay, there's fossils buried there under the rocks. We find them all. We all know the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, don't we? So the fossil evidence proves the world is old. I say it proves just the opposite. So first, how do you get a fossil? So here's a fossil of two dinosaurs locked in mortal combat. And they were instantly buried and preserved. This was a sudden event. To get a fossil, you need to have sudden burial. I mean, if a deer dies in the forest and nothing else happens, that does not create a fossil. Okay, the scavengers eat the flesh, the bones rot relatively rapidly. There used to be hundreds of millions of buffalo that have lived on the Great Plains over the last few hundred years. There's very few buffalo fossils. To get a fossil, you need sudden burial. The ancients thought that the fossil record was clear proof of the truth of Noah's flood. There is a fossil bank in Montana, a fossil bed called Hell's Creek, where the Tyrannosaurus rex sioux came from. Anybody remember that? It was in the paper for legal battles. And some of the biggest Tyrannosaurus rex ever. In that fossil bed are the fossil remains of at least 6 species of sharks. So what caused sharks and Tyrannosaurus rex to be buried in the same fossil bed? This is true, folks. Look it up. I suggest only a huge tsunami caused by the volcanoes and the disruption of the earth at Noah's flood could have possibly buried those species together. It wasn't some gradual water leak. Okay? During the flood, I think that you had global plates hitting each other like freight trains pushed up all the current large mountain ranges. So people say, well, okay, again, the dinosaurs died out and nobody's ever seen a dinosaur, to which I say, what do you mean nobody's ever seen a dinosaur? Until about 200 years ago, they used to be called dragons. Here is a carving in stone of in a temple in Cambodia of a stegosaurus. This is in stone. I could show you so many pictures like this. The American Indians, there's carved a brontosaurus in rocks, and so on, all around the world. Here's an artist. Here's an Italian guy. He did this sketch in the 1500s called Cats, Lions, and a Dragon. So cats and lions are a real creature, and he drew this dragon there. And this Italian artist had a bit of a reputation as being a pretty good, good artist, accurate artist. You may have heard of him, Leonardo da Vinci. So what about in the history? Okay, here we got a Roman in the 1st century AD. India produces the largest elephants as well as dragons. Yeah, Ethiopia's got dragons, but they're not as large as India. The Ethiopian dragons are only 20 cubits long. That's about 30 feet. 200 years later, another Roman. Yeah, that India is all full of enormous dragons. Not only the marshes, the mountains, the ridges. You can't turn around in India without hitting a dragon. There are reports of fighting dragons or encountering dragons / dinosaurs in the writings of Alexander the Great, the writings of Marco Polo. There's so much more evidence. If you go to Eastern Europe, there are so many towns that have the word dragon or stuff in their name. Here's something. There are at least 100 discoveries worldwide in dinosaur digs of dinosaur flesh. It's called dinosaur soft tissue. This is soft tissue from a Tyrannosaurus rex. We have dinosaur blood, dinosaur cartilage, and so on. And people will tell you that when you're in a dinosaur dig, there's the smell of death. My wife and I, we were in Buenos Aires a couple years ago, and we were at this really weird cemetery with mausoleums where Evita's buried. And in Argentina, at this place anyhow, your family's got to keep paying the rent or they kick you out. I'm not making that up. And while we were there, there was one poor soul who I guess the family didn't pay. So they were digging this guy up. And there was a smell. And that smell is in all dinosaur digs all over the world. Now, how did that survive 65 million years ago? You'll read these explanations of how this could exist, but there's scientific articles prove it. It wasn't just iron in the water, something like that. Dinosaur tissue, soft tissue, is a proven fact, documented in dinosaur digs all over the world. There are dinosaurs in the Bible. Here's the book of Job. Behold, which means pay attention. This is God talking to Job. Behemoth, it's usually translated on, which I made, God says, as I made you, eats grass, incredibly powerful. Look at verse 17. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. Now, cedars in the Middle East grew 30 feet high. So this animal has a stiff tail 30 feet long. It's not an elephant, folks. They got new names for these dinosaurs now, but it's that kind of dinosaur probably that I used to call a brontosaurus. And from the original people who translate the Hebrew will tell you that it's likely that when God said this, Job was looking at an actual brontosaurus. God was saying, look over there. Okay, so now we'll move on to geology. What's the geological evidence for this crazy thing called a global flood? Well, here's the Grand Canyon. Fantastic place. I bet a lot of you have been there. I got to hike across it about 10 years ago. I could walk better then with a couple of my kids. Now notice, so if you go there, they'll tell you, well, different levels or different ages in our Earth's history, right? You know, there's this level, and 100 million years later, there's this level. And here's something I didn't notice at the time, right? I don't think most people do. Notice how straight across those levels are. You see that? And by the way, these levels aren't just around the Grand Canyon. Some of these levels cover most of North America, these rock strata. They go for thousands of miles. But look at how those levels are straight. Here's a close-up of a barrier between two levels. It's supposed to be, according to secular estimates, 140 million years between those two levels. 140 million years. Do you see 140 million years of erosion? I don't see it. The estimates are that all of North America would erode and wash away in 40 million years, by the way. That's a lot of erosion. I don't see any erosion here. I don't see any plant and animal debris. You see a clear line. Here's a close-up of other layers in the Grand Canyon. There's supposed to be 5 to 10 million years between these two layers. I don't see the erosion. I don't see the organic debris. It's not there, folks. Also, there are these fossils, by the way, called polystrata fossils, which is a fancy word meaning they're in more than one layer. They're generally tree trunks. So how could a tree fossil have part of it below and part of it in another layer millions of years later? What's happening in these layers, you're looking at sediment laid down from different stages of Noah's flood. Only the flood explains the ice age. Everybody agrees that we had an ice age where much of North America was covered by ice 2 miles deep. That's a lot of ice, okay? There's no secular theory that can explain this. There's this astronomical theory that, well, the Earth wobbles a little bit every once in a while. It gets a tiny bit cooler, and somehow that means we get an ice age. Well, one scientist sarcastically said, that's like saying you walk into a room with a fireplace and you have a couple of ice cubes in your pocket and the whole room is going to freeze over. No, it doesn't work that way. No secular theory can explain the ice age, really. To get that much ice also, the Earth can't just get cold. I mean, if it got really cold, if the sun were to go out, you wouldn't get 2 miles of ice. There's not enough moisture in the atmosphere, folks. That's pretty obvious, right? I know there's a lot today, but you can't get 2 miles of ice. To get that much ice, you need warm oceans and reduced sunlight for hundreds of years. And only the flood explains that. What happened after the flood? The volcanic activity heated up the oceans around the world. And the ash from the volcanoes blotted out the sun. So you had reduced sunlight and incredible amounts of moisture for hundreds of years. And also, the flood causing the Ice Age explains so many things I don't have time to get into. You've probably heard about the mammoths, in Siberia. They dig up these woolly elephant. Well, the flood global climate models of the Ice Age, because the Arctic Ocean was warm, heated by the volcanoes, Siberia was a grassland, not the wasteland it is today. What happened was when the Arctic Ocean finally froze over, Siberia turned towards desert, started freezing. That's why you find woolly mammoths buried in piles of frozen sand. So you say, well, nobody's ever heard of this flood. So a couple years ago, I was at the British Museum, and for Christmas last year, I got this nice book, The Bible in the British Museum. So one of the first things they talk about is, well, the British went all over the world and stole things from everybody. It's amazing. I mean, they ripped off the Parthenon, go figure. So they ripped off this rock that basically has an account of the flood, and from Babylonian. And they say, and the guy who wrote the book says, well, we don't know who took the story from who. Did the Hebrews from the Babylonians, but my bet's that the Babylonians had the story first and the Hebrews copied it. So I'm reading this and I'm thinking, what bozo gave this guy, what university gave this bozo a college degree, right? With just a little bit of research, he would have known that there are over 300 flood stories worldwide. I mean, the ancient Hawaiians knew the name of Noah. They recently discovered a tribe in the Amazon that came into contact with scientists for the first time. Not only had memories of the flood, they had a memory of the Tower of Babel, the splitting of the languages. Yes, that was a real event. So these over 300 stories, very similar facts preserved over 5,000 years. A favored family, forewarned, flood due to the wickedness of man. It's just a flood, but it was a global flood, and people survived from a boat. Over 300 stories worldwide. Let's go back to that Jewish guy, Josephus, the emperor's historian. He writes about this. Now all the writers of barbarian histories make mention of this flood and of this ark. Nay, Nicholas of Damascus in his 96th book. I guess Nicholas Damascus liked to write, huh? I mean, that's a lot of books. I think he wrote over 100 books of history, all of which are lost. He was the tutor to the children of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. But here Josephus again, access to every book in the Roman Empire says that all the histories talk about the flood. All right, now we're going to get to physics. I love this part. I double majored in math and physics at MIT. So let's look at the evidence in physics for biblical creation. So first of all, I want to look at this maybe a little techie subject called magnetism. You're all aware, I think, the Earth has a magnetic field. What they've recently discovered is that the Earth's magnetic field is losing energy, and in about 1,500 years, it's going to be half as strong as it is now, and so on and so on. So the field, if you go backwards, the field was much stronger at the time of the flood. And this is what throws off the carbon dating, folks, because there was a lot less cosmic rays hitting the upper atmosphere when the magnetic field on Earth protects us from so much. So when you read, for example, that the Neanderthals were lived 35,000 years ago, they've got that wrong because their carbon dating doesn't take into account the decay of the Earth's magnetic field. And by the way, who were the Neanderthals? Well, they were people who lived in Europe during the Ice Age. They may have had some vitamin deficiencies, but this chauvinism that they were stupid people, they buried their dead, they had art. They actually had a little bit more DNA than we currently had on average, and they had bigger brains, I think. So, notwithstanding, they didn't have a good, public relations person. I think that's pretty clear. Why do you have magnetic fields? And there are magnetic fields on all the moons and the planets. There's this physicist called Russell Humphreys who's developed this theory that at the moment of creation, God aligned the hydrogen atoms in the universe. And that alignment is what gives rise to magnetism. You say, well, that's a weird theory, right? Well, he's able to predict by that theory what the Earth's magnetic field should be, and not only that, what the magnetic field should be of the planets in our solar system. And as we've gone out with satellites into space, our measurements track the theory as predicted in advance by Dr. Russell Humphreys. Okay, let's get into astronomy. And this is a picture of a spiral galaxy. There are billions of these in the universe. You see these spiral arms, they call them? Well, if that galaxy is billions of years old, those spiral arms shouldn't exist because they would have sort of mushed out into a continuous disk. It's sort of like if you're cooking and you drop something in and you start stirring, you get spirals initially, right? You've all seen that. But if you keep going, it all mixes in. Well, those galaxies with spiral arms can't be billions of years old. Also, you see all the blue stars, incredibly hot stars, and this is similar to the pictures of every galaxy. Those are blue stars burn so hot and so fast that they can't last more than 1 million or 5 million years. They burn up all their energy. Stars 100 times the size of the sun and so forth. So when you see all those blue stars wouldn't be there if that galaxy was billions of years old. Here's another fact. According to the Big Bang Theory, and I don't have time to get into all the problems with that, but one of the predictions is that when you look back at distance galleries, you're looking back in time. So when you look at a galaxy that's 5 billion light years away, you're looking back at how it was 5 billion years ago. 10 billion light years away, you're looking at a galaxy 10 billion years ago, and so on, and you should see immature galaxies in the process of being formed. Okay? That's what people thought. Then they actually looked, and they found, and there's 3 scientific studies on this, that all the old galaxies, the faraway galaxies, look just as fully formed as the nearby galaxies. Now let me address one subject that I know I might get a question on, which is, okay, if these galaxies are so far away, and they are, how come we can see their light? Right? The problem with distant starlight. And the short answer is we don't know how God did it. But it is a proven fact of physics that time, the magnetic field, gravitational fields slow time. For example, time in this room is going slightly slower than time on the GPS satellites above us. And those GPS satellites actually have to correct for that, believe it or not, or we'd all be running off the roads. And so with enough mass, you can basically stop time in one part of the universe on Earth and allow time to go on far away. You need a lot of mass to do that, about 25 times the amount of visible mass in the universe, which I mentioned just because if you've read about the missing mass of the universe, secular scientists think we're missing about 25 times the amount of mass that we have. So it kind of fits together. All right, let's get to why it matters. Why am I so passionate about it? Why do I think that this is an important subject for our world? And I'm going to give you now the number one reason why. I'm going to talk to the Christians in the audience why you should believe that the book of Genesis is history. The number one reason you should believe is that Jesus tells you it's so. This is from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus said to the disciples, "Just as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man." He's talking about his second coming. This is Advent season. We're celebrating his second coming, right, Father Chris? So Jesus says, "They were eating and drinking and marrying and being given in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all." So Jesus is talking, this is Jesus, not the Jesus with the Breck hair you see in some old pictures, you know, General Jesus, meek and mild. He's saying, look, when I come back, it's game over. And he's comparing his second coming to the flood and the destruction of the earth. So what do you make of that? He's talking to first century Jews, people who could probably trace their genealogy back to Adam, people who were familiar with Noah. Why, if this wasn't true, why would Jesus tell you it was true? And if you don't think what Jesus said is true, then I submit you've got a problem with Christianity. I mean, how are you going to believe that the back of the book is true? You know, the part where Jesus says he's going to come back and get you? The fundamental hope of all Christians. How do you think that that part of the book is true if you think the front of the book, the book of Genesis, is just myth? And especially when, and this is critical I think, especially when that same Jesus who you're counting on to tell the truth tells you quite clearly that everything in the Bible is accurate. Jesus quoted Genesis more than any other book in the Old Testament. This talk about the flood is all over the New Testament. Here's Peter's second letter. He's talking about people who scoff at God. He says, well, they're deliberately overlooking this fact that the heavens existed, the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. And equally important, if Genesis isn't true, why do we need Jesus? I mean, the Christian meta-narrative, the whole story, if you want to sum up the Christian Bible really quickly, is, well, God created stuff, people rebelled, we had this fall, there was a price to be paid for that rebellion. Jesus paid the cost, and we are redeemed through Jesus, and now we're waiting for the second coming. So if this all isn't true, then what the heck did Jesus come for? And here's Paul's letter to the Corinthians, "For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive." In other words, he's saying Jesus is the second Adam. Well, how can Jesus be the second Adam if we didn't have a first Adam? I want to thank you for coming. I just want to say I've obviously probably hit on a lot of subjects that might have surprised you. In the back of the room, I've got some free magazines. I'll take some questions in a minute, thank you. Called Acts and Facts from an institution, from the Institute for Creation Research. They do fantastic work. I know some of you give powerfully to causes you believe in. I'd ask you to look at the Institute for Creation Research. They are trying to change the world on a shoestring budget. You can also watch his Genesis history on Netflix. Go to creation.com and subscribe to Creation Magazine. And I want to thank you. I'll take some questions now, but I know I've kind of probably talked a lot. If anybody needs to leave, I certainly won't be offended. Yes, in the back there, sorry.
Okay. I was with you all the way, everything you say.
Is there a but in this sentence?
Sorry?
Is there a but coming in this sentence?
No, not a but. Just curious about what you think about the other planets. I mean, because he created everything.
Right.
And so what is your feeling on, if there is life, are they going to find Jesus?
Well, we found no evidence of life on other planets. People say there's a lot of planets, again, in the universe, but they have no idea how impossible it is to get life. And as far as the planets in our solar system, I think they serve a purpose. They signaled the birth of Jesus, and if you want to learn how they did, then you need to go to my website, countingtogod.com, and read my latest blog on who were the wise men and what was the Star of Bethlehem. Yes?
Where did God come from?
Great question. Who created God, right? So when you work through it, it turns out that something has to just be. You can't go back infinite. Infinity doesn't exist in the real world. You have to start with something.
But the infinity of you go back a million years, that it could start from there.
Infinity can't just start itself. You have to have, and this is actually a proven scientific theory, that you have to start with something that just exists by itself. And I think secular scientists would agree with that. In the Christian faith, God is that something that just exists. You know, when Moses asked God for his name in the Bible, what God says can basically be translated as, I am existence. I am the reason everything exists. Now that's strange, I'll admit it, but you've got to start with something. People want to say we started with the quantum field. Well, where did the quantum field come from? And that doesn't work for other reasons I won't get into. So you've got to start with something.
I have one other question.
Sure.
Who wrote Genesis?
It was given to Moses by God. That's what the Bible tells us. Yes?
How old is the universe?
Genesis says 7,500 years ago.
You don't agree that it's 14 billion years old?
I do not agree with that, and I've tried to give you some of those reasons. If you go to creation.com, you can, if you search for age of the Earth, you will see a list of over 100 scientific reasons why the universe and the Earth cannot be billions of years old. I've just given you the tip of the iceberg here of the scientific research on this. So you're right, I don't agree with it. And you should go to Netflix and watch that movie, Is Genesis History, which talks about time. And this is the big distinction, exactly. Is the universe billions of years ago or thousands of years old? Anything else? Okay, well, thank you very much for your time.